The sound of hooves tore through the quiet prairie, a slow, deliberate thunder that made the dogs pace and the crows scatter. Wyatt stepped onto the porch, eyes narrowing as three riders crested the hill. One in front, swaying in the saddle, the stench of whiskey carried on the wind. Two rough men flanked him, their hands resting too close to their guns. They reined in at the gate, dust swirling between them like a living thing. The leader dismounted, boots crunching against the dry earth. He stopped just short of the fence. "She's mine," he snarled. Wyatt's jaw set. "She isn't property. She never was." The oak's branches shuddered, and the air turned razor-thin with silence. The first light of dawn crept over the jagged Wyoming hills, spilling pale gold into the mist that clung to the pasture. Wyatt Morgan was halfway through saddling his horse when it came. A scream, sharp, raw, and human. It cut through the stillness like a blade. He froze, one boot in the stirrup, his weathered face tightening. For a moment he wondered if the fog had played tricks on him, but then it came again. Closer this time, strangled and desperate, like an animal in pain. Wyatt dropped the saddlebag, grabbed the Winchester from the barn wall, and strode toward the fence line. The frost-bitten grass crunched under his boots. Horses in the pasture lifted their heads but did not panic. There was no scent of wolf or cougar. As he rounded the corner of the barn, he saw her, a young woman slumped against his fence, tied like discarded livestock. The rope bit deep into her wrists. Her ankles were twisted beneath her. Dark hair clung to her cheeks, stiff with frost. A torn shawl flapped weakly in the wind. Her lips were cracked, her skin pale with cold and fear. Wyatt approached slowly, rifle slung over his shoulder, hands raised to show he meant no harm. Her eyes snapped open, wild and defiant. "Don't touch me," she screamed. "I won't," he said, voice low and steady. Even in that moment he saw the bruises, old and new, on her arms, the torn dress, the faint stain of blood on the hem. This was no accident. Someone had meant to leave her here. Moving carefully, Wyatt pulled a small knife from his belt and crouched. "I'm Wyatt Morgan. I live here. I'm not going to hurt you." She didn't flinch when he cut the ropes from her wrists, nor when he freed her ankles. But the instant the last cord fell, her knees buckled. Wyatt caught her just enough to ease her down onto the frost-covered ground. He slipped off his worn flannel shirt, folded it, and placed it beneath her head. Then he fetched a blanket from the barn, wrapping it gently around her shaking shoulders. She didn't speak. She only stared at him, as if still deciding whether he was real. "Rest here for now," Wyatt murmured. "We'll figure the rest out later." And for the first time that morning, her eyes softened, just a fraction, as the mist began to lift from the land. The cabin door creaked softly as Wyatt nudged it shut with his boot, keeping one arm steady around Clara's shoulders. The warmth inside was a stark contrast to the frost outside. A small fire smoldered in the hearth, casting flickering light across the rough-hewn walls. He guided her to the worn rocker near the stove, its wood smooth from years of quiet evenings. "Sit," he said gently. Clara obeyed, though her eyes darted toward the door, then the window, then the rifle above the mantel. Every muscle in her body seemed wound tight, ready to flee. Wyatt moved without hurry, without the sharp movements that might spook her. He struck a match, fed the fire with kindling, and set a kettle on the stove. The aroma of wood smoke and faint pine filled the air. He added marrow bones and chopped carrots to the old iron pot, stirring with the practiced rhythm of a man used to cooking for himself. Clara watched him in silence, her fingers curled into the wool blanket he'd wrapped around her. Her breathing was still shallow, her gaze tracking every move he made. She looked like someone braced for betrayal. When the soup began to simmer, Wyatt crossed to a small wooden shelf and took down an object wrapped in a strip of cloth. He knelt beside her, unwrapping it to reveal a pressed flower, purple aster, flattened but perfectly preserved between two thin sheets of paper. "My mother gave me this," he said, voice low. "Last day I saw her, before my father took me away. She told me, when the world feels cruel, look at it and remember even ugly things can grow beautiful." Clara's eyes flicked to the delicate petals, then to Wyatt's face. For a moment, something in her expression shifted, less guarded, more curious. He set the flower gently in her palm. "You don't have to keep it," he said, but maybe it'll remind you you're not stuck where you've been. Her fingers closed slowly around it, as if afraid it might vanish. The lines of tension in her shoulders softened just enough to notice. Wyatt stood, returning to the stove. Behind him, he heard the faintest sound, a breath that might have been a sigh, or the first crack in the wall she'd built around herself. In that quiet, a fragile trust began to take root. By the third morning, the whispers had already taken on a life of their own. In Larkspur, gossip didn't walk. It galloped. From the saloon to the general store, from the church steps to the post office porch, the same story twisted through the air. Wyatt Morgan had taken in Earl Bennett's girl, and it wasn't out of kindness. Clara heard it even without leaving the cabin. The weight of other people's judgment seeped through walls and windows. She felt it in the glances Wyatt caught when he rode into town alone, in the way neighbors avoided his eye. That morning she stood by the door, wearing one of Wyatt's old shirts cinched at the waist with twine, her hair brushed smooth. "I want to go with you today," she said, her chin lifted. "You sure?" Wyatt asked, pausing mid-repair on a saddle strap. "I'm tired of hiding." He didn't argue, just reached for the spare hat hanging on the wall, its wide brim soft and well-worn, and placed it gently on her head. They rode into town side by side, hooves echoing on the hard-packed dirt. The air felt heavier with each storefront they passed. People stopped what they were doing. The blacksmith's hammer froze mid-swing. A mother pulled her child away from the trough. Too fast, too sharp. They reached the general store, Wyatt dismounting to tie the reins. Clara followed him up the steps, her head lowered just enough to see the ground, but not the eyes staring at her. Then a sharp voice cut through the stillness. "Well, I'll be damned." Mrs. Hollis, the widow in black with a tongue like a whip, stood blocking their path. Her face pinched tight, eyes full of venom. "Bringing your filth into town now, are you?" she sneered. Wyatt stepped forward, positioning himself slightly between the two women. "We're not looking for trouble." "Too late," Mrs. Hollis spat. She bent, scooping up a handful of dry dirt from the road, and flung it. The clod struck Clara's boot, scattering dust across the step. "Get out of here!" the widow hissed. Wyatt didn't raise his voice. He simply set a steady hand on Clara's shoulder, turned her away, and walked her back down the steps. The whispers rose like gnats in the heat, but he didn't look back. The ride home was silent, but in that silence, Clara knew he'd just told the whole town whose side he was on. The midday sun was sharp and white when Wyatt spotted 3 riders cresting the ridge beyond his pasture. They weren't neighbors. He knew that instantly. The lead man slouched in the saddle, reins hanging loose, a whiskey bottle swinging from one hand. Even at a distance, Wyatt recognized the sagging hat, the uneven gait. Frank Bennett. 2 others flanked him, hard-eyed with the look of hired fists. Their hands hovered near their gun belts, casual in the way only dangerous men could be. They stopped at Wyatt's gate. Dust hung in the still air. Frank swung down, boots crunching against the dry earth. "She's mine," he slurred, breath sour with liquor. "Blood don't disappear just 'cause you say so." Wyatt stood square at the gate, voice low but steady. "She stopped being yours the day you left her tied to my fence. She isn't property. She never was." Frank's smile twisted. "That girl's been a weight around my neck since the day she was born. I don't want her back. I want her gone. Folks talk, Morgan. Keeping her makes you look like a man with something to hide." Wyatt didn't blink. "The only thing I'm hiding is her from cowards who think people can be owned." A tense silence hung between them, broken only by the rustle of wind through the oak leaves. Wyatt stepped forward just enough to close the air between them. "If you think you have any claim, step through this gate, and I'll put you under that tree before sundown." Frank hesitated. The 2 hired men shifted uneasily. Then, with a muttered curse, he backed away and mounted his horse. He didn't look back as they rode off, but Wyatt stood at the gate until the dust finally settled. The storm outside had settled into a steady patter, rain tapping against the cabin roof like distant drums. Inside, the fire burned low, casting a soft amber glow over the room. Clara sat cross-legged on the rocker, Wyatt's wool coat wrapped tightly around her shoulders. Her eyes were fixed on the flames, but her voice, when it came, was sharp, deliberate. "I was 15 the first time he tried to trade me." Wyatt didn't move, didn't speak. He just waited. She swallowed. He lost a card game, said I could clear the debt. The other man looked me over like I was a horse at auction, decided I was too skinny, damaged goods. Her mouth twisted at the memory. My father beat me after, said I'd embarrassed him, called me a curse, said even death wouldn't take me because the devil had no use for what no man wanted. Her words hung in the air like smoke, bitter, clinging. Wyatt's gaze stayed steady on her, but then he reached for the buttons of his shirt, pulling the fabric aside to reveal the pale ridges of old scars crisscrossing his back. Clara's breath caught. Who did that? My father, Wyatt said quietly, believed obedience was the price of love. I didn't. The rain filled the silence between them. He reached into the pocket of his vest and pulled out a small, tarnished silver locket. My mother gave me this the day she died. Said it wasn't worth much in silver, but it might be worth something to the right person, someone who needed a reason to hold on. He placed it gently in Clara's hand. She stared down at it, fingers curling slowly around the cool metal. I'm not worth saving, she whispered. I'm not clean. Not right. Wyatt leaned forward slightly, his voice firm but soft. You're not broken. You're alive. That means you still get to choose what comes next. Tears welled in her eyes. I don't think I deserve this. Not the fire, not this coat, not you. No one is born deserving, Wyatt said. We earn it by how we live, by what we give back. Her head lowered until it rested against his shoulder. He didn't move, didn't speak, just stayed steady while the rain and fire filled the quiet with warmth. The air felt different that morning, heavy, watchful. Wyatt sensed it before he saw the dust rising on the horizon. 5 riders moved in a slow, predatory arc along the fence line, rifles slung low, their coats the color of dried blood. At their center rode Samuel Devereaux. No badge, but everyone in the Wyoming territory knew his name. His black stallion moved with a predator's ease, the silver trim on his saddle catching the dull light. Wyatt didn't wait for the knock. He stepped into the cabin, his voice low but urgent. Clara, it's time. She was already by the door with a small satchel, her eyes sharp. Wyatt handed her a Winchester, the wood worn smooth from years of use. 2 shots at a time, then reload. Aim for the legs. Slow 'em down. They slipped out the back, boots silent on the dirt, and crossed to the barn. Wyatt hoisted her into the loft, then vanished into the shadows below. Gunfire cracked the air, short, wild bursts meant to intimidate. Devereaux's men spread out, circling like wolves. Wyatt's first shot took one in the knee. Another spun and dropped, cursing. Confusion rippled through the group. Then a door burst open. One of the gunmen charged inside, rifle sweeping the dark. Wyatt crouched low behind hay bales, waiting, but the man moved too fast, stepping dangerously close to the ladder to the loft. Clara's breath came quick and shallow. Her hands trembled around the Winchester. She remembered Wyatt's words. Aim for the legs. The man's boot hit the ladder rung. Clara squeezed the trigger. The shot was deafening in the small space. The gunman's body jerked sideways, collapsing into the straw below. Blood darkened the dust. Wyatt glanced up. She was still shaking, the rifle clutched tight, but her eyes met his. He gave a single, steady nod. She nodded back. Outside, Devereaux reined in his horse, watching the barn with an expression caught between calculation and fury. He dismounted, walked to the fence, and called out, "This isn't over, Morgan. The girl's mine, and I'll come collect." Wyatt didn't answer, just leveled his rifle at the man until he swung back into the saddle. As the outlaws rode away, Clara exhaled for the first time in what felt like hours. Spring came slowly to Wyoming, the frost retreating from the earth in thin silver threads. Each morning, the sun rose a little earlier, painting the hills in gold and coaxing life from the thawing soil. Wyatt and Clara worked side by side, their days measured not in hours but in the quiet rhythm of repairs. Together they patched the barn roof, replaced split fence rails, and cleared the winter's debris from the garden plot. Clara planted neat rows of carrots, onions, and wildflowers in the soil behind the cabin, her bare hands pressing life into the earth. Neighbors began to appear, not with questions or pity, but with tools and offerings. Old Mr. Avery helped to dig post holes. Mrs. Carter brought seed packets and a jar of peach preserves. The blacksmith arrived one afternoon to repair a hinge, leaving without charge. No one spoke apologies for the whispers that had once followed Clara, but she saw the change in their eyes. Respect replaced suspicion. Wyatt never said much, but she noticed the quiet ways he cared. He fixed the kettle she favored when the handle cracked. He kept the garden gate swinging smoothly on oiled hinges. He mended her boots and set them by the fire each night, clean and dry. One evening, as the horizon burned orange and pink, Clara stepped onto the porch to find Wyatt standing beside something new, a hand-carved wooden chair. Its lines were simple, the surface sanded smooth, the arms curved just right. She moved closer, fingers brushing the warm wood. At the top rail, small and precise, were her initials. "You made this?" she asked softly. Wyatt shrugged, eyes on the wheat fields. "Figured you needed somewhere to rest." Clara lowered herself into the seat, the view stretching wide before her. It felt solid, permanent. For a long moment, neither spoke. The breeze carried the scent of fresh earth and sage. Then almost shyly she said, "If I wanted to change my last name, what would you think?" Wyatt paused mid-swing of a fence hammer, then said simply, "Plain as water. I'd take yours." And for the first time in weeks, Clara laughed, the sound warm enough to carry across the field. The days had grown longer, the sun lingering on the horizon as if reluctant to leave. Clara often found herself on the porch in the evenings, seated in the chair Wyatt had made for her, watching the wheat sway in the breeze. Wyatt would be nearby, mending a tool or carving a small piece of wood, their silences as comfortable as spoken words. One evening, as the light softened to gold, Clara traced the carved initials on her chair. Without looking at him, she said quietly, "If I wanted to change my last name, what would you think?" Wyatt didn't stop what he was doing, but his hand slowed, the hammer resting lightly against the fence post he'd been fixing. After a moment, he said, "Plain as water. I'd take yours." Clara's lips curved into a smile, one of those rare, unguarded ones that began in the chest before it touched the face. "No one's ever offered to be mine before," she said, her voice more wonder than confession. Wyatt glanced her way, the faintest trace of a smile beneath the brim of his hat. He didn't answer, but the look was enough. They didn't speak of love, not in words, not yet, but the weight of it was there in the way he set her boots by the fire each night, in the way she kept a fresh cup of coffee waiting for him at dawn. As the sun slipped behind the hills, Clara leaned back in her chair, and Wyatt sat beside her. No promises were exchanged, yet everything that needed saying was already understood. The bond between them wasn't born from rescue, it was shaped by choice, quiet devotion, and the kind of trust that didn't need to be spoken aloud. The evening light was low and warm when Wyatt stepped behind the barn, a brittle sheet of paper trembling in his hands. It was the contract Frank Bennett had signed years ago. Cruel, ugly words scratched in ink that tried to turn a living soul into property. Wyatt crouched near a small fire built from dry twigs and pine needles. For a moment he studied the paper. The ink faded but still poisonous. Then he bent low and held it to the flame. It caught fast, curling into black edges, flames eating the words until nothing remained but drifting ash. The wind carried the remnants into the wide Wyoming sky, scattering them like a past that would never return. The next afternoon, under the shade of the great oak tree that had witnessed so much, Clara walked alone down a path of packed earth. No one gave her away. She had no one to give her. Her steps were steady, each one pressing deeper into the land she now called home. The townsfolk had gathered in a small circle, the sheriff with his hat in hand, Mrs. Carter clutching a bouquet of wildflowers, the blacksmith standing awkwardly with scrubbed hands. A fiddle rested against a chair, ready to play. Wyatt waited beneath the oak, wearing a clean white shirt, his hat held to his chest. When Clara reached him, he met her eyes, steady, quiet, certain. From his pocket, he drew a small silver ring, shaped from a horseshoe nail and polished until it gleamed. Slipping it onto her finger, he said softly, "No one's giving you to me. You came here on your own, and I'm proud to stand beside you." Clara didn't cry. She only nodded, a faint smile touching her lips. The ceremony was brief. No grand speeches, just the sheriff's few words, the soft tune of the fiddle, and the applause of neighbors who had once doubted her. When the sun dipped low, they returned to the porch. Clara sat in her carved chair, Wyatt beside her, their hands intertwined. The ashes of the old contract were long gone, carried far beyond the hills. What remained was theirs alone, a life built on choice, respect, and a quiet kind of love that didn't need to be announced to be real. The last traces of daylight lingered over the prairie, streaking the horizon with soft gold and violet. The air was cool, scented with sage and fresh earth. Wyatt and Clara stepped onto the porch, the old boards creaking gently under their boots. They didn't speak at first. The quiet wasn't awkward. It was the kind that had weight, like the earth after a long rain. Wyatt settled into the chair beside hers, the one he had built with his own hands. Clara eased into her seat, fingertips brushing over the initials carved into the backrest. Without looking, Wyatt reached across the space between them. Clara's hand slipped into his, her fingers warm and sure. The cabin behind them glowed in the lamplight, a beacon against the encroaching night. Out in the distance, the wheat swayed in the breeze like a slow, steady heartbeat. Somewhere beyond the hills, the lives they had left behind still existed. But here, they were untouchable. Clara glanced sideways at him. "Evening, Mr. Morgan," she teased softly. Wyatt's mouth curved just enough to be a smile. "Evening, Mrs. Morgan." They sat like that as the sky deepened to blue, watching the first stars flicker awake. Fireflies drifted lazily over the grass, their brief sparks winking in and out like promises kept. For Clara, the porch wasn't just wood and nails. It was proof. Proof that she could choose where she stood, who she stood beside. Proof that the girl once tied to a fence had become a woman with roots, with a voice, with a life entirely her own. For Wyatt, the quiet beside her was different from the silences he'd known before. It wasn't the emptiness of solitude, but the fullness of something shared. He realized that freedom didn't always mean being alone. Sometimes it meant having someone who chose to stay. The wind shifted, carrying the soft rustle of the wheat and the faint scent of the wildflowers Clara had planted. Fingers still intertwined, they stayed there long after the stars had taken the sky. Their new life wasn't grand, but it was theirs, built on choice, bound by respect, and lived in the open air of a freedom neither of them would ever give up. Out here on the plains, the world moves slow enough for you to see the truth of things. Some battles aren't fought with fists or guns, but with the quiet courage to stand your ground. Wyatt and Clara's story reminds us that freedom isn't just the absence of chains. It's the right to choose who we stand beside and the life we decide to build. In today's world, maybe we're not mending fence lines or staring down an outlaw at the gate, but we still face the same questions. Who do we trust? What do we protect? And when the world tries to tell us our worth, do we accept it or do we write our own measure? Perhaps you see a bit of Wyatt in yourself, a steady hand in a storm, or maybe you felt like Clara, learning to believe you deserve peace, respect, and a place to belong. Now I'd like to hear from you. In your own life, what does it mean to stand your ground? Do you believe love built on choice is stronger than love born from rescue? Share your thoughts in the comments. You might just give someone else the courage they need. And remember, stories like this aren't just about the past. They live on in every act of kindness, every stand for what's right, every quiet moment when we choose dignity over fear. Thank you for riding along with us on this journey. If this story stirred something in you, please hit that like button, subscribe to The West That Never Left, and ring the bell so you don't miss the next ride. Because the West, it never truly left. It just waits for those who remember how to find it.